This webinar is titled Return of the Gods, the United States Supreme Court Destroyed America's Foundation. Well, this image is from New York in 1956 on Good Friday. And what's remarkable about this is from 1620 to 1963, over 340 years, it was understood that Christianity was the solid foundation upon which our nation and its institutions were built. Of this same time period, there were presidential quotes highlighting this. This is not even from the founding era. This is from this time period. And I'm going to quote at length Herbert Hoover, who said this in 1954. Our founding fathers did not invent the priceless boon of individual freedom and respect for the dignity of men. That great gift to mankind sprang from the Creator and not from governments. The founding fathers, with superb genius, welded together the safeguards of these freedoms. Today, the socialist virus and poison gas generated by Karl Marx and the Frederick Engels have spread into every nation on the earth. Their dogma is absolute materialism, which defies truth and religious faith. Their poisons are of many sorts. The preservation of the safeguards of liberty makes it imperative that we give heed to their every variety. A nation is strong or weak, it thrives or perishes upon what it believes to be true. If our youth is rightly instructed in the faith of our fathers and the traditions of our country and the dignity of each individual man, then our power will be stronger than any weapon of destruction that man can devise. President Hoover continued, "And now, as to this whole gamut of socialist infections, I say to you, God has blessed us with another wonderful word, heritage. The great documents of that heritage are not from Karl Marx. They are from the Bible, the Declaration of Independence, and the Constitution of the United States. With them alone can the safeguards of freedom survive. These new frontiers give us other blessings. Not only do they expand our living, but they also open new opportunities and new areas of adventure and enterprise. They open new vistas of beauty. They unfold the wonders of the atom and the heavens. Daily they prove the reality of an all-wise, supreme giver of law." President Eisenhower said this in 1955, "Without God, there could be no American form of government, nor an American way of life." Recognition of the Supreme Being is the first, the most basic expression of Americanism. Thus the Founding Fathers of America saw it, and thus with God's help it will continue to be. Well, these presidents got it right, but the Supreme Court got it wrong. And here's a rundown of how the destruction began and was fulfilled. In 1947, Everson versus Board of Education, the Supreme Court created the doctrine of separation of church and state without citing any precedents. In 1962, the Supreme Court threw prayer out of school, citing no legal precedent and overturning over 170 years of American history under the U.S. Constitution. In 1963, they threw the Bible out of schools, classes showing the Bible as the foundation of Western culture thrown out, citing no legal precedent, overturning 170 years of American history under the Constitution. And in 1966, they began the process of declaring pornography as a form of approved free speech. So the Supreme Court in 1947 said this: "The First Amendment has erected a wall between church and state. That wall must be kept high and impregnable. We could not approve its slightest breach." They said this without citing any precedents, and the court created its own political doctrine. 11 years later, in 1958, the justices point out that this is a false political doctrine. They said this: "Much has been written in recent years concerning Thomas Jefferson's reference in an 1802 letter of a wall of separation between church and state. Jefferson's figure of speech has received so much attention that one would almost think at times that it is to be found somewhere in the U.S. Constitution." What they were saying is if the courts keep using this phrase over and over again, people will begin to believe that it's in the Constitution. And that's exactly what the people began to believe, and the court took advantage of that. So in 1962, in Engel versus Vitale, the prayer that was outlawed was this simple prayer that was said in the classrooms all over America: "Almighty God, we acknowledge our dependence on Thee, and we beg Thy blessings upon us, our parents, our teachers, and our country." But this was too much for the Supreme Court. They banned it. A verbal prayer offered in a school is unconstitutional, even if it's both voluntary and denominationally neutral. It's interesting to note not one legal precedent was cited. There was no precedent to cite. This court ruling overturned over 340 years of educational history in the United States and 170 years under the Constitution. For 170 years, what the students had been doing in schools was now unconstitutional, according to this 1962 Supreme Court. Again, citing no precedent, this Supreme Court overturned this history. It was just 1 year later that volunteer Bible reading was banned. To this point, schools had classes on the Bible as an historical book and a foundation book of Western culture, but this was too much for the Supreme Court. In 1966, the Supreme Court begins loosening pornography laws. The Massachusetts Supreme Court held that a book in Massachusetts was patently offensive, but the justices on the U.S. Supreme Court said they knew better and overturned that Massachusetts ruling. So here we have it, 1947, 1962, 1963, 1966. But they continued. In 1973, the destruction of life was approved. They destroyed the protection of the preborn by creating the doctrine of privacy and creating a right to abortion, citing no precedent. In 1973, additional pornography was approved as free speech, and again in 1974, the same. In 1980, they threw the Ten Commandments out of schools, overturning 190 years of American history, citing no precedent. In 2003, they threw the Ten Commandments out of public view by not accepting a lower court case, in essence standing down while monuments were being removed or torn down. In 2003, they destroyed the sanctity of sex, ruling that homosexual sex was a protected class and constitutional. In 2013, they continued their destruction by destroying marriage and family by overturning the Defense of Marriage Act. And in 2015, they continued their destruction, requiring all states to issue marriage licenses to same-sex couples, and thereby sweeping away 30 state laws defining marriage as between a husband and wife. And in 2020, the destruction of gender, men and women, the word sex in the civil rights law was changed by raw judicial power to also mean gender identity. Justice Neil Gorsuch, a deciding vote in this 5-4 decision. Calvin Coolidge said this: "The foundations of our society and our government rest so much on the teachings of the Bible that it would be difficult to support them if faith in these teachings would cease to be practically universal in our country." For 340 years, this was the foundation of our country. The United States Supreme Court put into motion the destruction of the faith foundation on which the country had been founded and on which it had continued to strive to make a more perfect union. There's a Bible passage that says this: "When an impure spirit comes out of a person, it goes through arid places seeking rest and does not find it." In the United States, the power of the cross existed for 340 years, but the Supreme Court began to throw it out. So it says, "Then I will return to the house I left. When it arrives, it finds the house unoccupied, swept clean, and put in order. Then it goes and takes with it 7 other spirits more wicked than itself, and they go and live there. And the final condition of that person is worse than the first. That is how it will be with this wicked generation. We throw God out, we create a void, and wickedness fills the void." This should give us all something to think about. This is Christian Civics Training. Thanks for listening.